everybody? It's your man James, Mr. Quinn Treasures, back again with some more video action for you. Hey, Did you dig that new intro? That's right, folks. I'm telling you, I'm going like crazy with this stuff. You know, I'm getting so good at those. I probably should start running out my skills to folks. I think because I think there could be some great shows out there that could use that kind of production value. But I thank you all for joining me today, and I want to welcome you to a brand new venture here. Now, as you guys know, I've started the one called the Sequential Art Showcase, where I talk with an artist about who I own some of their art, and we showcase some of their work. And I thought, well, that's a great show. It's kind of limiting because it's only having artists and artists who I have art by personally. So I thought, what could I do to have even more expansive, discussions with lots of great creators whose work maybe I don't have, and how do I get in writers and things of that nature. So I've created this new show called the Creative Conversations, and what we do here is just bring in a guest, and we just talk about their work. We talk about whatever it is they feel like talking about at the time, and we just have a great conversation for you guys to give you guys some entertainment, maybe some insight into their work, into them as people, all that great kind of stuff. So I hope you'll be joining me on this little venture here, and I plan to do more of these in the future. So without any more delay, let's get into it. This is our very first premiere episode, and I got to say, I'm excited about it. Not just because it's the first episode, but because of the great talent I have here. This is a man who has been in the comics for well over 4 decades. We all know him. We've all read his work at Marvel, DC, Valiant, Dark Horse. He's been everywhere. He's been everything, from sci-fi to superheroes to horror and real life crime drama, all the kinds of genres you could think of, and then some. This man is one of the legends of the industry. It is my honor to have him on the show today. So I bring you guys here the one, the only, the bloody Red Baron himself, Mr. Mike Baron.
Hey,
Mike,
guys.
welcome to the show. With that enough build up?
Too much.
No, but I just to give you all here a little heads up here. I am a big fan of Mike's, because as you can see here, I got my autographed Punisher book by Klaus, and if we look on the inside here, there it is, the Mike Baron Sr. So I am a big time fan. This is a real treat for me. A treat that is great in the wake of Halloween having just passed. So now I get another treat. This is awesome. So we're gonna get into it here, and we're gonna have a little discussion here with Mike. We're gonna talk some work, talk about some how he does what he does, some of that philosophy perhaps of what he does, and have a little fun with it. So to get it all started, why don't we just start with the beginning, Mike? Where did you first get into comics? Like little Mikey, what was his first comic? What is it that got you into comics and made you say, hey, this is something I want to do?
Uncle Scrooge.
Really?
Yeah. When I picked up my first Uncle Scrooge and read it, I knew that it was extraordinary. I mean, I had a sense. I hadn't read it. Was the first comic I ever read, but I read it and I said, well, this is not trash. I had no idea that I was going to become a professional writer at that point. That happened a few years later when I bought my first John D. MacDonald paperback, and I had an epiphany on the street that said, this guy is not writing this for his health. He's doing this for a living. Well, that's what I want to do. It just took me a long way to get there. I didn't become a comic fan until I went to college at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And friends started showing me Steranko and the work of Neil Adams. And I was so blown away by the art, which was far beyond anything I had imagined, that I became a fan right there. And I was lucky enough to know both those guys, and Jim is still with us. I saw him last year, and we correspond occasionally. And like so many others, I was fascinated by the art and the individual aesthetic of each artist. After university, I moved to Boston, where I worked for a number of newspapers, and I was buying the art as it came out. I was particularly fond of Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson's Swamp Thing, Roy Thomas and Barry Smith's Conan, Denny O'Neil and Mike Kaluta's Shadow. Books like those with a unique and powerful art. And actually, those guys, the writers, did not disappoint me. But many times, I'm not going to name the book. It's a book that I loved because the art was just mind-blowing. But the stories were so pedestrian and were not up to the level of the art that I was disappointed. And that was the case with many of the comics of that era and of this era. is that an artist perfects his craft and develops an individual aesthetic. And you know what I mean by that? That means that you can tell an artist at a glance. If you're a real comic fan, you could look at a page of original art and say, that's Jim Lee or that's Todd McFarlane, right
Exactly.
away. Uh, but you have to read the book, or I mean, the book has the credits at the front. But so often, and it is the case today, still, is that most comics are pretty bad. There was a great science fiction writer named Theodore Sturgeon. He coined Sturgeon's rule. Sturgeon's rule is 90% of everything is crap, and that still holds true today.
And, well, I've heard similar things. Like I've done, referencing and sort of like looking into things like actual novels and things. And I've read that, like, for a publishing company, like, 90% of the books, 80% of the books they put out don't make money. One book will break even, and then there's that one hit that pretty much keeps everything else running. And that's how it pretty much goes in the book industry. So I can't imagine it's very much different in the comic industry.
Well, there have been huge changes in the comic industry. They've lost sight of their mission. People buy comics and they go to movies to be entertained. Number one job is to entertain.
Yes.
Uh, Beyond that, if you have a message to deliver, you can do it if you know how to do it. And I always point To Kill a Mockingbird and The Grapes of Wrath, which were both very powerful novels and very powerful movies that we can watch over and over again because they're entertaining. Uh, I don't know when it happened, but about 10 or 15 years ago, the comic publishers gave up on entertainment and started hiring people who were all message. Uh, they had an axe to grind. And you can see that axe on the first page. It's hard to get around the axe. And I'm sure you all know what I mean. That we've seen books lately which seem to have an agenda, a political agenda, and they deliver the agenda with lectures usually. Now, nobody wants to be lectured. And when you put a lecture in a comic book, it's particularly tedious. There's a trick to grabbing the reader by the throat. And of course, rule number one is to entertain. Well, how do you do that? There are a million ways, but most obviously, I'll give you the first three that come to mind. Number one is you have a fascinating character that everybody loves and wants to know more about and wants to know his or her adventures because they're exciting. Sherlock Holmes comes to mind. He's the most popular fictional character in history. There are probably 100 times more Sherlock Holmes novels, which we call pastiches without Conan Doyle, uh, since Conan Doyle's death than there were during his day. And he wrote, I believe, 57 Sherlock Holmes stories. He tried to quit at one time when he wrote his last bow, and Sherlock and Moriarty went over the falls, and that was the
Yeah.
last anyone heard of him. But the publisher said, "Come on, man! People are writing in; they want Sherlock Holmes. It's what they're buying." So he came back again and again. Number two is you have a fascinating scenario, a situation. You have a situation that in itself is appealing. And when I think of that, the first thing I think of is Jurassic Park. People interacting with dinosaurs. What could go wrong? And most of those movies, especially the early ones, are pretty entertaining. And of course, so many comic fans are also dinosaur freaks. That's just a felicitous crossover. Number three, you have a seductive narrative voice. Now, that's harder to do in a comic or a movie than it is in a novel, but it's certainly possible. Uh, I think of writers like Alan Moore or Denny O'Neil, who knew how to spin a tale. In there are a lot of ways to have a narrative voice. There's the zero way, which is where the narrative voice completely disappears and you're not aware that you're reading word constructs because the words are put together so smoothly and in such a simple manner that you're completely immersed in the story, the experience. Uh, I think Michael Connelly is the master of that. He's a crime writer in Los Angeles. He created the Harry Bosch novels and the Lincoln Lawyer novels. When I read his books, I'm not aware of his narrative voice, which is a wonderful thing. It just proves what a great writer is. And at the opposite end of that spectrum, you have somebody whose narrative voice is fun to read. It's seductive in and of itself. I'm thinking of Michael Chabon is a contemporary writer who has that, as is James Elroy, who writes crime novels. He wrote L.A. Confidential, and I'm sure that most of our viewers have seen that. It's an outstanding example of modern noir. But when you read Elroy's own prose, he writes like a machine gun. Nobody writes like Elroy. It's rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, one 4 and 5 letter sentence after another, very simply stated. And the reason for this is because he learned to write reading the lurid pulp magazines, crime and sex pulp magazines of the 60s and 70s. And when you look back, of course, Conan Doyle had a very distinctive narrative voice when he had Dr. Watson relate the adventures, and people have tried to emulate that. Dickens had a seductive narrative voice, and so did Mark Twain.
Yes, I get what you're saying. I understand exactly what you want, especially about the when you have the voice where they sort of suppress their voice in the story to give more to the creation itself. One person I've always admired, one of my favorite writers of all time, is Bill Mantlo, and he was said of him that he knew how to get any character's voice just right. So when you're reading a story, you're not reading a story where he's trying to get you to see what he wants. He's writing the story for the character. So it's the character that comes through, not his message or anything he may want to put into it, but the character. And that's what matters most. And that's something I agree with you it's something that's been lost in a lot of comics today, especially in the mainstream, is these great icons we've all come to know and love and cherish for decades, and the people working on them, they don't understand how to do what someone like a Bill Mantlo did, of like putting the character's voice ahead of their own, because that's what the audience is there for. They're not there to hear, like you say, a sermon or a preaching message. They're there to see the characters do what we want them to do and to entertain us. And that's something that I think has been lost in a lot of stuff today. I totally agree with you on that.
Well, a good writer has to put himself into the head of every character he's writing. He has to imagine that point of view, or he'll never be a real world-class writer. Shakespeare, of course, was a master of imagining every point of view. He wrote Othello uh, about a black prince. And, there are people today who would say, "Oh, you can't write about black people. That's cultural appropriation." To which I always say, should persons of color and Inuits and South Sea Islanders, should they be permitted to use telephones, airplanes, automobiles, and air conditioning? Isn't that cultural appropriation?
It only ever seems to run one way. It never runs the equal way
That's
for
because
that.
of envy.
Exactly.
Because Western civilization is really the highest form of civilization. And a lot of people that aren't partaking of it are extremely bitter and envious of it. Uh, but to get back to imagining every point of view, I think of uh, Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers. Many people don't know this, but Mr. Dumas was Haitian. He was black. And
No, I didn't know that.
his stories live forever. And of course, William Styron, who wrote The Confessions of Nat Turner, which is a story of a black rebellion during the Civil War. He also wrote Sophie's Choice, about a woman who's shipped to the Nazi concentration camps and faces an unthinkable choice. And anybody who's read the novel or seen the movie knows what I'm talking about. Those are world-class authors. Mark Twain, of course, was another one, with Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Well, it seems to me that like what you're suggesting here is that like the greatest writers that we know, they knew how to go beyond their own point of view and what they want to say, and see other points of view that can make a more well-rounded story and a more well-rounded, basically a more rounded universe that you were trying to immerse a reader in.
That's right. The more credible the story is, the more the reader will enjoy it. And I have a good friend, a writer, who says a good writer can lead the reader anywhere, anywhere in the world. The most outlandish situation, a good writer can make the reader buy it. And the trick is to just imagine every point of view. Now, of course, that comes with experience. They say, write what you know. There was a great English author called John Brain who wrote Room at the Top. That's his most famous novel. But he also wrote a book called Writing Your Novel. And in it, he says, no one should attempt to write a novel before they're 40 years old because they simply don't have enough experience, which I think is pretty funny because Carson McCullough wrote The Heart is a Lonely Hunter when she was 24 years old. And To Kill a Mockingbird, Harper Lee wrote that when she was 33. There are always exceptions to these, and I hate them. It took me a long time to learn how to write a novel, but part of that's because I'm a slow learner. But when I get it, I get it. And about 15 years ago, I got it, and so I've been writing novels ever since. I thought that my output was um, pretty prolific, but then I have friends who publish 6 novels a year.
Wow. Well, speaking of prolific, let's take a little roll down memory lane of your career here, so we can see some of this great work that you've been doing over the years, and we'll start it out with early in your career with stuff like Vanguard Illustrated and Death Rattle. Remember those? And back in the
Yes,
day,
I
this is
do.
the days of the fanzines when they ruled the world and things of that nature. When you had all this like just immersive creativeness, as I see it, is like the late 70s, early 80s was like a time of like lots of experimentation, lots of people just trying to get stuff out there and create new works that weren't the same old thing, and just just trying to stretch your imagination, as it were. And so tell us a little about your time when you were doing these kinds of books like this.
Well, I'm particularly proud of my work with Kitchen Sink. Dennis Kitchen was one of my first publishers, and I got to work with the great Rand Holmes, who did that cover you're looking at. And obviously, Rand Holmes is the ultimate Wally Wood disciple,
Yeah,
in
I
the
definitely
same
see
way
the
that,
Wally. I definitely see the Bollywood influence.
Kelly Jones is the ultimate Bernie Wrightson disciple. But the thing about Death Rattle was working in the underground, and I read every underground comic I could get my hands on. I'm particularly fond of the work of Robert Crumb, who I think is a genius, and Gilbert Shelton, whom I think is a genius. And one thing about those guys is not only that was their art absolutely distinctive and memorable and attractive, uh, but their stories were well thought out and absorbing. When you read a fabulous Furry Freak Brothers story, it's really entertaining. It's got a lot of laughs. It's got dynamics. They knew how to entertain. I think part of that is because they were doing whatever they wanted, and it came from a very personal point of view and personal experience. R. Crumb is the most fearless cartoonist on the face of the earth for the things that he showed us and things that he drew and the stories that he imagined. And he's been called a racist, a sexist, whatever you want to call it. And you can understand why when you read some of his stories and see some of his creations. They do seem to take certain racist or sexist points of view to the extreme, but that was just him bearing his soul. He's also a very fine artist when he wants to, and I mean fine art. I have a lot of his books, and when he draws people, just to draw the person as they exist, the renderings are masterful, and they're unique. I mean, you can tell at a glance that it's R. Crumb, but there were many great artists working back in the day. Rick Griffin is another one that comes to mind. Uh, all those
Well,
stories.
Well, for me, I kind of take it from the perspective that I heard Graham Nolan once express. He said that how like there's the golden age of like the 40s where like basically comics come to the fore where it's like they're a whole new genre, and then he said then you had the silver age, which is sort of like a revamping of all that. He goes, and then the next golden era, he said, is the early 80s with the independent explosion of just all these different voices you had never heard before, doing things you'd never seen before, with ideas that were never, used before, between the Comics Code Authority of the 50s and, the artistic changes that came along in the 70s, like you noted, with guys like, Neil Adams and Steranko, all culminated in this great revival and like renaissance in the 80s as like the next golden era. And I see now, looking at how he said that, I look at the current times, like with all this crowdfunding stuff, is sort of the next ushering in of the new wave that we saw back in those early 80 days with the independents.
Yeah.
But so this is where you begin. But then, of course, you went on to bigger and better things, some would say, and then we end up to DC here. And I thought it was interesting how you worked on so many different books that weren't the same thing. Like you even got Atari Force, which is vastly different from the Flash, which is vastly different from was it Sonic's Disruptors? All these things you did at DC that just cover like a gamut. And I wondered, how is it you approach writing something that's things that can be so vastly different? Like I said, like here we got Flash and Atari Force, vastly different concepts, and yet there's still a way you present them that works for people. How do you manage to be able to go with so many different genres and types and make them all seem cohesive that way?
Before I get into that, I should point out that the only reason I was asked to write those books was because of the success of Nexus and Badger, which I created for Capital Comics. Nexus was really the first comic that I created. That you did show a story that Steve Rude and I did prior to Nexus, when we heard there was a publisher in town, and we approached them about doing material, and they said, we want a superhero. And that got my mind spinning. And the first thought was, well, what would make him compelling? Because there were so many superheroes, there always are. And I thought, well, if every time he showed up somebody died, that's the stuff of drama, and that's not a great insight. That's why popular entertainment has been dominated by crime, police, medical, and legal stories for the past half century, because that's the stuff of life and death, and that's the stuff of drama. But I wanted him to be a sympathetic character, and so I made him a reluctant executioner of mass murderers. Now, anybody who's familiar with the title knows that that's just a jumping off place, and that it grew and it grew to create this immense artificial world that the dude and I created, that's still out there, and of which I have to reference frequently when I write new stories. I got the Punisher assignment because Carl Potts got his hands on the Badger and he liked it and he thought I could write the Punisher. I'm particularly pleased with my Punisher run. I got the Flash assignment because my editor at First Comics, where I published Nexus and Badger, was Mike Gold, and Mike Gold got kicked upstairs to be an editor at DC, and he gave me that gig. And whenever I get a character, a corporate character, a character that's not mine, I respect the roots, I respect the source, and I respect the personality. So I read Flash. I saw what he was doing, and I noticed there was a gap in his credibility, and the gap was, where's the energy coming from? I mean, you can't just have a Rice Krispie bar for breakfast and then run at 800 miles an hour across the country. Uh, so I thought this guy has to consume massive amounts of calories. And that was one of the insights I brought to the story. And, after a year, after I did 13 issues, I didn't know what to do anymore. So I gave it up. Today, that wouldn't happen. I'm a much different writer today, although I use the same principles, I hope, which is to respect the source material and to respect the medium of comics. And here's an important thing that a lot of people don't understand about comics. Even professionals who have been working in the field for decades, is the less words you use, the more power they have. Now, this is not an argument for a wordless comic. I don't like them. You can flip through those in 5 or 10 minutes or 15 if it's a big graphic novel, and you admire the art, but the story does not stick in your mind. It's those memorable phrases in context that you remember. like Face Front, True Believers, it's Clobber in Time, Face It Tiger, You Just Hit the Jackpot. When those
Avengers
first appear,
Assemble.
yeah, yeah. When you first see those in the context of which they were offered, they resonate because it was the first time, it was appropriate, and it all works. When I write a comic, I try to keep captions to a minimum. I will put down a caption that says Atlanta 1954, just so you know where you are. But so will a movie. A movie will do that too. And I save the words for the characters. It's a visual medium, and any information you can impart to the reader visually that advances the story, you should, and save the words for characterization. But this doesn't mean that you can't have dialogue advance the story, because sometimes that's unavoidable and it's natural as well. People talk out their plans to see if they'll
Yeah.
work or not, and so you can do that. The key is to make the words memorable. And that means to shun cliches, to stay away from cliches. How many times have we read, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore? Anybody who writes that in a comic book has no business writing comic books. I always approach each comic with a bag of words. Let's say the bag has 500 words, and each of those words is a gold coin. So I parcel them out like gold coins. Now, if I get to the 501st word, all of a sudden that bag turns to steel. And if I get to 600 words, it turns to lead. I keep that in mind. Every time I look at anything I write, I find a way to improve it by taking words out. I also strive to have people talk the way they really talk so that their speech sounds natural. One thing about superhero comics is they're always addressing each other by their names. Bullhawk, I say, what do you say to this? Well, Miss Minerva Flybag, and just, we know their names. You don't have to repeat their names in every panel, but that goes on a lot. And then, of course, there's the curse of Stan Lee. And I love Stan Lee. I knew him, but he had a habit of writing his characters in this stentorian, bastardized Shakespearean prose, where how darest thou approach the grand wazoo without taking off thy hat, and stuff like that. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that's the way you should write a comic. Now, there might be characters that speak like that, not in my comics, but there might be characters that speak like that, and then it's appropriate. But far too many comic book characters speak like that.
Well, I guess that's why they call them writing tropes and cliches. Then is because they've just become so ingrained in the medium that people just, when they think of them, those are the things that they think of, is those big boisterous, you know, uh, exposition of the characters and things of that nature. Is just sort of the nature of the piece. Kind of in a way, it's they become a victim of their own success in a way, I guess you could say, because they become so popular.
Where these books are not popular now, as you know, they're circling the drain. Nobody wants them. Uh, but
But
and there are many reasons for that. It's not just the bad writing. There's also we have a whole generation that doesn't read. They were raised on the
yeah,
internet. They play video games. And let's face it, a good video game is far more entertaining than a $5 corporate comic. But now the video games are in serious trouble for the same reason the comics were, because they brought in a bunch of activists who try to politicize everything. And that's not
yes.
why people play video games. They want to have fun, they want to be entertained. Same reason they go to the movie.
Well, entertaining comics for me is this right here, your work on Dead Man. I think some of your best work, outside of maybe some of the Punisher stuff, because I'm a big Punisher fan. But I think outside of that, the stuff you do with Dead Man, especially like Love After Death, is one of my favorite Dead Man stories of
Thank
all
you.
time.
Yeah, I'm
It's
very
just
proud of that.
it's a
That's
very
also
beautiful story. It's got so much heart in it, and you would think that'd be kind of difficult with a character that's supposed to be dead, and yet there's so much emotion in that story that it comes through. And then you got the beautiful Kelly Jones art, just that haunting visuals of his, and it's a perfect marriage. To me, this is like one of the best of your career was Love After Death, and just beautiful stuff. How did you come up with a concept like that?
uh, it was very simple. Up until then, he'd been a superhero, and that was the wrong approach. He was really a horror character. Uh, and I'm not sure that that was my insight. Um, it may have been Paul Levitt's insight. When I got it, I said, "Well, how do I handle this?" And Paul says, "Well, maybe he's a horror character." And then I took it from there. And of course, that's the book on which Kelly Jones became Kelly Jones. Uh, and I'm very proud of those books. He exploded on that book, and we did 3 more graphic novels together, which are readily available, and they've been reprinted in these giant size hardbound books, which you can get. I don't know if the publisher's still around. I have to go look at the book to remember the name of the publisher.
Yes, like I said, this is just some of the best stuff I think you've done. But you did do other things, other places, such as at Valiant here with Archer and Armstrong in the hardcore. Now, how did you approach this? Because I mean, these are not like your typical superhero type characters, and these definitely aren't what you would call like independent characters, like the stuff you did early in your career with things like Death Rattle. How did you approach something like a whole new universe of characters like this?
Well, first you read all the books. I have to say that Barry Smith is an impossible act to follow, that I never really caught the zeitgeist that he had in those books. But I went on to work on other characters for Valiant, of which I'm very proud, including Shadow Man and Ninjak. Those stories I understood, and Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, that I did with Rags Morales, and I'd love to work with Rags again. He's a great artist. We're still friends. Um, but that was it for Valiant, and then Jim Shooter created Valiant, and then he left, and Bob Layton was in charge. And Bob gave me a lot of those assignments, for which I'm grateful. And you won't believe this, but I'm writing for Valiant again. They've been taken over by Alien Books, and they are publishing my latest Nexus graphic novel with art by Kelsey Shannon, which is Nexus Scourge. It was designed to be broken up into two 22-page comics, or 24-page comics, two 24-page comics. And the first one is going to be in comic stores in December. And the second
Nice.
one will be in comic stores in January. They're in the current previews. You can look them
And what
up.
which company is it that is publishing these?
Well, it's called Alien, but they control all the Valiant characters. Alien bought Valiant. They will probably publish it under the Valiant imprint, but when you look at the
Okay.
indicia, it will say Alien Publishing.
Oh, interesting. That's it. That I did not know that. That's new information for me. And then, of course, you have your time at Dark Horse. Now, here you're working on the Hammer of God, and then Star Wars of all things. Is there a franchise of majorness that you haven't touched in some way or form? I mean, it's just
Oh,
crazy to me.
there are hundreds, 90% of them, I'm sure. I would much rather work on my own characters.
But how do you approach something that is so well known, like say for example a Star Wars, that everybody knows what Star Wars is, and the expectations of the readers and the fans of what Star Wars is supposed to be. We've seen in recent times how they react when you don't meet those expectations. How is it you approach something that is so well known to the populace, that like you said, it's in the zeitgeist, everybody knows what this is? How do you approach that to make sure that it comes across the way it's supposed to, but yet you still get your style in there?
That was a very easy job. All I did was adapt Timothy Zahn's novels. I didn't use any of my own words. Every word in all those comics came straight out of the novels.
Wow, I did not know that. So I guess that would make it kind of easy to do that when you're not doing your own thing, but you're just following the trail of someone
Sure.
else.
I just took each novel, I broke it up into 6 roughly equal sections because each one had to yield 6 comics. And then I went through them. I decided what part would go on what page, and I distilled it down so that the story remained more or less the same. It was less wordy because, first of all, you don't need a narrative voice describing every scene. Timothy Zahn's a very visual writer, and he describes it enough, or better than enough, that all I could just draw it out on the page. By the way, that's how I wrote comics for 25 years, was by drawing each page out by hand. And I would recommend this to anyone who wants to create comics, whether they can draw or not. You can use stick figures. My art is bad, but it's good enough that you can tell at a glance what I'm doing. I can do a little perspective. I can do some architecture, spaceships, people, dogs. You look at it, you know what I'm getting at. Everybody loved it, editors and artists alike, because you could tell at a glance what was going on. But more importantly, it taught me so many valuable lessons, such as how much weight can a page bear? And by that, I mean, how many words and pictures can you put on it? I had a habit of doing 6 panels a page, and I thought, well, that's pretty lean compared to the heyday of Marvel when it was 9 panels a page, and sometimes it was 12 panels a page. And since then, I've pared it down even further. I will go to 6 or even 7 panels if there's dialogue involved in talking heads, but the words are not going to squeeze the characters out of the panels. I get it down to the essence of what I want them to say, and I want the language to be entertaining in and of itself, which means that you have to create language that's distinctive and memorable, like Face Front True Believers. Only I don't write in that style, that grandiloquent, kind of semi heroic style. I try to make my characters absolutely real. And I do that by giving them dialogue I think real people would say. And that's a gift, because when you listen to real people talk, they don't talk like the words are spelled. One thing I noticed over the years is when anybody I knew said, I'm going to, it sounded like Omina. I'm going to go downtown and get a case of beer. Omina, Omina. So I started using that in my scripts, and it sparked a reaction because people recognized right away what
Yeah.
I was doing, and they appreciated the authenticity of the language. And I do that a lot. I keep my ears open. I carry a pen and a pad with me everywhere I go. And if I overhear somebody saying something in a fresh way, I'll write that down. Uh,
Wow.
the trick,
So even now you're still learning
oh,
things
all the
in your
time.
writing.
Yeah, and I'm getting better, and I've never been busier in my life.
Well, speaking of busy, of course, we couldn't go through your career without touching on good old Frank Castle, who we all know in more recent times have really done kind of dirty. But like during your tenure, to me, you are the premier Punisher writer. I
Oh,
mean,
well, thank you.
I love Chuck's work. You've done a lot of great work with the character. Stephen Grant did some good stuff in that miniseries, and of course, he was created by Gary Conway. But to me, when I think of the Punisher, the voice, the utilitarian mindset, those captions that are just like bullet to the point without any wasted words, any wasted thoughts, I immediately think of your Punisher.
Okay, excuse me while I dive out of sight here for a minute. Oh yeah, I just found it. All right. Uh, I approached Punisher as a straight crime comic. For 3 years, there were no science fiction, space travel, aliens, or monsters. Frank took on crooked bankers, drug smugglers, psycho gangs, and crooked
Terrorist.
preachers. Yeah. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I noticed that Marvel had become disgusted and embarrassed by the Punisher. He was so icky, he was so violent. And so they emasculated him. They did ridiculous things with him. They dragged him through the sewer. And I said, that's not what the comic should be. So I created Private American. Private
So this is sort of
American
this is
is
you sort of like bringing the Punisher back to the roots of saying this is what the Punisher should be.
well, yeah, except that when I asked myself, well, what would the Punisher be doing? The answer came to me immediately. He'd be on the southern border intercepting drug smugglers, sex traffickers, and terrorists. And that's what he does in this book. And as soon as word got out of this book, the far left attacked me. The Daily Kos,
I
which is a
remember.
far left hate site, ran an article headlined Punisher creator Mike Barron releases another racist AF comic book. Well, first of all, I didn't create the Punisher, Jerry Conway did. And secondly, it was written by a person who's never read anything I've written. She certainly hadn't read the book because it hadn't been released then. And she had purple hair. But that helped us. It always helps us. In fact, as I mentioned a little while, well, I don't know if I mentioned this, but Antarctic is releasing Private American right now. It's going to be in comic shops next month
Awesome.
in 3 issues. And because of that, there's another far left hate site masquerading as a comic news site called Bleeding Cool. And the editor of that site came out once again and said, well, here's this book about a vigilante shooting immigrants on the border. Well, nothing of the sort happens. In fact, he saves the immigrants from being raped and killed. But he hadn't read the book, and many readers pointed that out to him. And he got very defensive. And in fact, the Twitter feed went on for 2 days. It might still be going on, but it's the same old, same old. The society's riven right down the middle, unfortunately. And many friends I had will no longer speak to me simply because I'm a conservative. But I've discovered a whole new world, and I'm sure you're aware of it. The world of crowd-funded comics, and we're doing
Yes.
just fine. And I'm speaking of Comicsgate and my own books, but also the Rippaverse. My
Well,
first
we're going to get
Rippaverse.
into some of this because like I said, it's funny you bring them up because that was the next thing. It's like here you are working at the Rippaverse on Gooding the Polymath. Now, how did this all come about? Did Eric July reach out to you, or did you reach out to him?
No,
How,
I
how
reached. I was said, Eric, let me write for you, and for some reason he said, yeah.
Gee, I can't imagine why a guy who's starting up his company who has someone who's worked on multitudes of books over 4 decades with being one of the most premier writers of like a character like the Punisher. I don't know why they'd want you to write for him.
Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, wait till you see the next title. I wish I could even. I wish I could tell you the name, and I signed a non-disclosure agreement. I can't even tell you the
NDAs,
name.
NDAs. Yep.
But he should announce it soon. In fact, I was just with Eric at SpaceCon in San Antonio over the past weekend, and with my editors, the delightful Soska sisters, with whom I'm working on some different projects. Uh, and I hope that they're going to bite. Well, first of all, he bought this second title I suggested, and it's going to blow your mind. I can't wait for it to
Wow.
come out.
Well,
But I've also,
I'm actually very excited for the next one that is coming out, The Horseman from Chuck Dixon and Joe Bennett. So I'm definitely looking forward to that one. But yeah, if you got another one coming, bring it on. The more the merrier.
yeah.
But now we'll get into some of your work, stuff that you have created, because like I said, we've kind of gone through all the stuff from others, but this is your stuff. Like I said, you talked about Nexus and the Badger. These are probably like your children in a way. The
That's
ones
right.
who really put you on the map and really got you noticed. What was it about these characters? What was it? Like you said about how you want to get your voice in there without overriding a character, but these were characters who were new, and so the voice basically was your voice. What is it you were wanting to say? What is it about these characters you felt was something that needed to be said with
Well,
these
first of
characters?
all, I have to emphasize it's not my voice. It's the voice of the characters. And as I mentioned before, every good writer has to imagine every point of view. And I am not these characters, but they do represent an ideal of a sort. Nexus is, I don't know if you would call him an anti hero, but he's certainly a hero in that in his adventures, he saves the downtrodden, he punishes mass murderers, and he's turned his planet Ilum, which comes from asylum, into a home for the homeless. Whose own planets have become inhospitable for whatever reason. Now, as for the Badger, that was just a weird circumstance, a weird congruence of epiphanies. I was living in Madison at the time, and of course, the badger is a state animal. The Badgers are the team of the University of Wisconsin. I'm walking up and down State Street. I see Badger Liquors, Badger Pub. And I said, the Badger. And I was also reading The Minds of Billy Milligan by Daniel Keyes. Daniel Keyes was a great science fiction writer who wrote Flowers for Algernon. But The Minds of Billy Milligan was one of the first serious studies of multiple personality. So I made Badger multiple, and it was very liberating because in his persona as the Badger, he had no inhibitions. He would say anything and do anything. He was a champion of animal rights. His only superpower was being able to communicate with animals. But there were 6 other personalities, and not all of them were very savory. And the base personality, Norbert Sykes, uh, was a real zero. He had very little personality. He was a veteran. He enlisted in Desert Storm. He had terrible experiences there. But his multiple personality problem dates back to childhood. And anybody who's familiar with multiple personality knows that it's caused by extreme childhood trauma, often sexual. It can be just violence and abuse.
We
Uh,
saw that. We saw that with the Hulk. That's something that they injected into the Hulk's DNA, as it were. In the '80s, is that he was a victim of child abuse
hmm.
at the hands of his father, and that's what brings it all about.
Well, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's I think it was an Incredible Hulk number 312, written by Bill Mantlo. It was a tie-in to the Secret Wars 2 event that was going on at the time, and the Hulk was on at the crossroads. And this is where we learn in the Hulk's origin that his father was abusive to him and his mother, and that this is where all the Hulk's rage comes from, is the fact that he was tormented by his father. His father said, "I hate you. You're a monster." Because his father was supposed to expose to radiation. He thinks it altered his son and made him a monster. And so all this rage that the Hulk has comes from that experience of his abuse at the hands of his father. And so that's what makes him the Hulk.
Interesting. Of course, I did a lot of research into multiples, and we did a very serious treatment of it for Dark Horse that was illustrated by Jill Thompson. Um, but I much prefer the Crazy Badger, and so do readers. I mean,
Yeah.
he called everybody Larry, and every time I go online, somebody's calling me Larry. And I like to have a lot of fun with him. And in fact, there's new Badger that is shipping from First Comics that nobody's ever seen before. I wrote it 6 or 7 years ago, and it hasn't been released until now. Hang on a second. Let me see where when that's coming out. It says it's in shops January 29, 2025.
There you go.
And it's illustrated by my longtime partner, Vale Myerick, with whom I worked on many of the Valiant projects. And I'm very happy with it. You're going to love it. And I'm happy it's coming out.
Sounds good. Can't wait to see that. But speaking of coming out, this is again more of your more recent work, the Thin Blue Line and Florida
Yeah.
Man. Now this stuff is interesting to me because I heard you say, I think it was I'm not sure if it was a podcast or maybe it was a live stream, but you said something to somebody is like, you don't pick your stories pick you.
That's
Now
right.
what is that philosophy? How does that work? And especially with characters like Florida Man and the Thin Blue Line, how is it these stories are picking you? What does that mean, and how does it mean? What does it mean to your approach to the work in that way?
Well, in the case of Florida Man, every time I went online, there was another Florida Man story. Florida Man claims syringe found in rectum is not his. That's fairly typical. But after I'd seen about 50 of these, I thought, well, somebody ought to write a comic about this guy. And boing. And Gary Duba is my protagonist. The stories are not sordid. And Gary, he's just a redneck living in a trailer down by the swamp. He likes to get high. He likes to get stoned. He's been in and out of trouble with the law his whole life. He's got a hair trigger temper, but he's got a heart of gold, and he'd give you the shirt off his back. And that's the key to the character's success. And Gary and his wife, Crystal, and you see Crystal there with the gator, They're in and out of trouble constantly. Uh,
Yeah.
Gary's always looking for his next get rich quick scheme. And there are two graphic novels available now that what you're
He's
looking at.
kind of the Ralph. He's kind of the Ralph Cramden of comics. Always got that next get rich quick scheme going.
Yeah, and of course he's both naive and incredibly experienced at some things. And Gary's bane is the invasive species that have hit Florida. He's constantly struggling with invasive species like the anaconda, the iguanas. In one of the novels, he and his best friend Floyd, who's an exterminator, um, they gather together about 500 dead iguanas they found in a pool for I don't know what it was, and they try to take it to uh, an orphanage that's run by the Catholic Church, and they're dressed up as Santa, both of them, and they're drinking, and the nuns say, no, no, we don't want these, no, no, and Gary says, I know. We'll take him to the Church of Necroeconomics, and that's the Church of Scientology, which owns a town in Florida. So he and Floyd are drinking, and they pull up in front of the Church of Necroeconomics, and they open the rear door of the van. They start shoveling dead iguanas out, yelling, ho, 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 ho. And the guard comes running out. What the hell are you doing? He says, we're giving you these dead iguanas to feed the orphans. It's funnier when I wrote it, but that's just a little example of what goes on there. Uh, I have a new Florida Man graphic novel in the works. It's the funniest comic ever written. You're going to laugh out loud. I guarantee it. If you read any of these Florida Man comics, you will laugh out loud. I
Well,
guarantee it.
I've been getting the Florida Man comics, and yeah, they are quite amusing. Some of the things Gary gets into is just, it's you're like, I don't want to believe it, but yet I believe it.
And in the case of Thin Blue Line, that happened during the summer of 2020, uh, when cities exploded in rioting. Thousands of small businesses owned by people who could least afford to lose them went up in flames. There was murder after murder. And in each case, there was some jackass from the so-called news media, I call them the lick spittle, standing out in front explaining that these are mostly peaceful protests. And then politicians, people who swore an oath on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, started calling for defunding the police. And the first time I heard that, I was incredulous. No society can survive without respect for law and order. Now, we all know there are bad cops. I've met some bad cops, but this story is not about them. It's about two cops trying to survive a night of riots in a large Midwestern city. It was taken right out of the headlines. The reaction has been overwhelming because it's first and foremost entertaining. You're going to love these cops. You come to care about them. They are very real people. The response was great. And as a result of this, police officers started to contact me from all over the country. First of all, thanking me for doing the story. And secondly, saying, would you take a look at my novel? You wouldn't believe how many cops want to write novels and do. And some of them sent me their novels.
Wow. I'm guessing a lot more crime related novels.
You think so? There are some cops who really know how to write. Paul Bishop is one of them, and I'm working with Paul now on a Sherlock Holmes pastiche. Paul was a detective for the L.A. Police force for 30 years. A great guy, and of course, there's Joseph Wambaugh, who's the king of the policeman turned novelist. You're all familiar with the stories, the Onion Field, the Black Marble. Uh, well, that's enough. But listen, if you love, and Joseph Wambaugh is a very rare writer. He's got a unique narrative voice, and he will make you laugh and cry in the same sentence.
Wow, that's a great writer if you can get people to laugh and cry. But and of course, again, we got some more of your self-creator owned works here. Again, we spoke about Private American being sort of your pastiche of the Punisher being done correctly. rather than the way they've done him now. And then we got Bronze Star. So what is this? I never pictured you as like a Western writer,
Well, I
and yet
didn't
here you
either,
are.
but I'd always wanted to work with Pat Broderick. So I said, Pat, what do you want to draw? He says, I want to draw a supernatural Western. I said, well, all right. Now, I don't want to give the story away, but the twist in this is that uh, my protagonist, Harley Brogdon, who used to be a Quantrill's raider who fought for the South during the Civil War, is forced to flee ever northward because they put out a bounty on every Quantrill raider because they did some pretty awful things. But Harley did not do those awful things. He's a decent guy, and in a poker game, in self defense, he shoots this loudmouth who drew on him, who was cheating. And didn't know that the loudmouth's father was a wealthy landowner who gets a posse together to chase Harley to the ends of the earth. So he flees north to Canada to a tiny little town at the foot of the Rockies. And it's a very peaceful town, especially after dark. And the reason it's so peaceful is because the sheriff is a werewolf. No, I can give that away because that's not the main reveal of this story. And it is a horror story. You're going to love it. The reaction was overwhelming. It's the greatest work of Pat Broderick's career. It's unbelievable the detail he put into these drawings. And he's working on the second issue right now.
Wow. Yeah, like I said, I just, when I think of your work, I mean, you've done a lot of great stuff, in sci-fi and action and superheroes, but I never thought, Mike Baron, Western writer. I just never thought I would see that. That's just not something that ever crossed my mind of like a Mike Baron type story. So when I saw that, I was just like amazed. It's like, wow, he's doing Westerns now.
Which brings us to my latest project.
Yes. So let's bring that up here. I will get things going here. All right, and let's share it up. This is Mike's latest venture here, Sherlock Holmes Leviathan. It's going to be about, of course, the great detective himself. And before we get into anything else here, let's watch the video.
When a series of shipping disasters points to a mysterious sea monster, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson leave the comfort of Baker Street and board a freighter where they encounter unexpected betrayal and come face to face with the enigmatic Captain Nemo and his submarine, the Nautilus. As they delve deeper into the case, they uncover a conspiracy involving a Russian Tsar with an airship that rains destruction on unsuspecting cities. With time running out and the world on the brink of war, the heroes must use all their skills and resources to stop a massive conspiracy and prevent global conflict. From Eisner-winning writer Mike Baron and illustrator Richard Bonk, dive into the depths of adventure and unravel the mysteries of the sea with the world's greatest detective in Leviathan. Order now on Indiegogo.
So there we go. That is Sherlock Holmes Leviathan.
It's not on Indiegogo yet. That'll come later in November. But right now, it's going live tomorrow. And it's going to be on Fund My Comic first. We give them an exclusive because we like them so much.
So what was it that made you want to do a Sherlock Holmes story?
I don't know. It's funny that I've always been fascinated with the character. I was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars when I was in high school. We'd meet in a cottage in Madison to talk about the stories. And lately, I had been on a Sherlock Holmes kick. I've been watching a lot of the old movies and shows, and I just thought, I would love to do a Sherlock Holmes story. So from there, it goes from there. And the idea of crossing over with the world of Jules Verne just seemed natural to me. The whole thing kind of fell into place. I've always loved submarine stories. At one point, I thought I'd like to be a submariner, but I can't think of anything more horrible now than being a submariner. No, I don't want to be a submariner. But I still am fascinated by them and their abilities. And one of those abilities, of course, is to cruise underwater right over the North Pole. So it became a continent spanning adventure involving Russia and a madman whom the Tsar uh, fears because this madman is making demands on him and is about to ignite the First World War. You will recognize the madman if you're familiar with Victorian fiction, and there are a few other ringers in this story that are going to blow your mind. Uh, it's funny about that explosion of Victorian fiction towards the end of the 19th century. You had Jules Verne, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Charles Dickens, and of course Conan Doyle. All these great characters born at the same time, and it was a smaller world then. And it's been they're interacting and teaming up is not new. I mean, Alan Moore did the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and there have been other team ups, notably by Philip Jose Farmer, who teamed up Tarzan with Doc Savage. Only his were Lord Tiger and Doc Caliban. Philip Jose Farmer created something called the Walden universe, in which all these Victorian characters interact with each other and live in the same world.
Interesting, very interesting. Like I said, it's like a time period that we don't really think about much anymore. That Victorian era, it's kind of like it's not something that people speak on. You don't see a lot of like movies or any kind of other kind of media based on that period of time. And so I just thought it was quite interesting that of all times, like right now, you would choose to come out with a Sherlock Holmes book.
Yeah, and simultaneously, that new network is coming out with a series all about Captain Nemo called Nemo. I saw the trailer and it just looks fascinating. I have to see it, and I will. But that's nothing new. I mean, these synchronicities happen all the time. I remember one year, two major studios in Hollywood both came out with a volcano movie.
Yes, I remember. It was Dante's Peak and Volcano.
That's right. And then another year, two major studios both came out with a Christopher Columbus movie, and of course they were unaware of the others. And then I'm sure they both found out midway through filming, and said, "Well, we've already sunk $20 million into it. We can't stop now."
Can't stop midstream. That's one of the things about Hollywood is like even when they know they're making mistakes, they're just like, well, we just got to keep making them because we're already halfway through. We can't stop now.
Well, they did bury that Batwoman movie.
Batgirl, yeah, that was funny. I mean, it makes me wonder just how bad is it? If it's so bad they buried it after it was like 95% done in pre-production and post-production, and we're going to bury it now. It's like, how bad could it be?
It could be bad, but there are good movies being made all the time. Two recent movies I saw that I thought were great were Ferrari, starring Adam Driver as Enzo Ferrari, and Monkey Man, starring Dev Patel. Just one of the greatest action movies I've ever seen.
Awesome. I'll have to check those out. I think I'll about cover everything here, but before we go, I'll do a quick little show here for Mike because he was very gracious to come on with us today, and I was going to say head on over to his website, which I'll have linked down there below, and it's Baron Comics and Graphic Novels, and you can see right here there's a shop, and you click on the shop button. You can see some of the great stuff we talked about here today: Florida Man, Nexus, Private American, Thin Blue Line. All these books are available. You can get them for yourselves and check them out and see some of this great work that Mike's been here to share with us and tell us all about. So definitely want to check out his site there. I also have a link down below to the Indiegogo page for the upcoming Sherlock Holmes Leviathan, which Mike says, will by the time you guys see this, will be up on Fund My Comic. And then shortly thereafter, a couple weeks or so after that, it will be live on Indiegogo. Make sure to go back that and help get more of these great stories out there because we could always use more good stories and less bad ones. And so if we need to support the people who do the good stuff like Mike Barron, And I'll just end it here and say I want to thank Mike Barron for joining me today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on here with me. And this was a lot of fun. And I hope you guys got some enjoyment out of this. Maybe you learned a couple things about writing. And the last thing I'll do is I'll ask Mike, if as a writer yourself, what is the one piece of advice you would give any other writer out there who's either writing or want to think about writing? What is the one piece of advice you say more than any other that they should always keep in mind?
Carry a pad and a pen with you at all times.
And be very observant to what's going on around you, I would assume. Okay, well, there you go. I guess you can't give more better advice than that, folks. So again, I thank you all for joining me today. I thank my guest, Mike Barron. I hope you guys had some fun here. I certainly did. I learned some stuff even I didn't know. So that's always a good time when you learn a little stuff yourself. But I want to thank you all for joining me today, and I'll be back again with some more stuff for you guys very soon. And so until next time, take care.
Thanks, Jim.